Thanks for being with us today as we consider the prophet Ezekiel. We started our series with Moses at the burning bush, and we didn't get a chance to talk about it because Moses is such a giant character in the Old Testament that 5 times Moses tries to get out of being, the God's spokesman in going back to Egypt. Then we had the prophet Isaiah, and we had his call, his vision in the temple where God's presence, I believe it said that the robe of the hem of God's robe filled the temple. And then after that we had Jeremiah, which was a little bit, I'll say a little bit more normal, in that he's called, and then his response, is, well, I'm too young, I can't do this, certainly you can find somebody else, somebody better, whatever it might be. Well, today we have Ezekiel, and, this is really his vision, and the story around him is just so fantastic. The interesting thing here is Ezekiel and his vision they're not even in the land of Israel. They are actually in the land of the Babylonians, the Chaldeans, where this all happens. So we will talk a little bit about the biographical information in chapter 1 of Ezekiel and go on. Again, it's a long book, and it's hard to I'll say, summarize Ezekiel's message as God's prophet, as God's messenger in the world. But, we'll see a little bit about that. So Ezekiel starts out the first chapter, first verses. In the 13th year, in the 4th month of the 5th day of the month, as I was among the exiles by the river Kibar, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. On the 5th day of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiachin, the word of the Lord came to the priest Ezekiel, son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans by the river Kibar, and the hand of the Lord was on him there. So that's, kind of a lot of words and, some time mentioned, but what we can say is this is the year 593 BC. And what we can say, because we absolutely know the river Kibar was actually a created canal, and so we know almost exactly where Ezekiel was in the year 593. And one of the things, again, as I've mentioned before, that people who want to read the Bible from beginning to end, which is fine, but it's a bit of a challenge just in understanding the order of things, and with the Old Testament, understanding the history of things. The sort of history that's involved here is, although we think in terms of the temple being destroyed in 586, 587 BC by Nebuchadnezzar, 10 years prior to that, the Babylonians came along, and in order to save the city, to save the temple, the religious leaders and the political leaders were all already taken away into exile 10 years before the temple was destroyed. And so it's interesting that we have Ezekiel already in exile, pointing out to all of us that Ezekiel is from a wealthy family. He's obviously a religious leader. And so he's in exile, and it's in exile that he then has this vision of God. If you remember, it's a kind of an older book and made kind of a sensational splash years ago. I think it was published before I entered the seminary even. Eric Van Daniken wrote his book, well-known book, The Chariot of the Gods. And the point of that book was that, flying saucers actually came and visited Earth and helped the Egyptians build the pyramids. How else could they get these several-ton stones all the way up to the top of this thing? Well, we know more about that now. Nobody ever really is concerned about flying saucers visiting Earth. But as we read on here, we'll see where the concept of flying saucers comes from. So after the biographical information, Ezekiel says, "As I looked, a stormy wind came out of the north, a great cloud with brightness around it like flashing forth continually, and in the middle of the fire something like gleaming amber. In the middle of it was something like 4 living creatures. This was their appearance. They were of human form." And then skipping some verses to verse 15. "As I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the earth beside the living creatures, one for each of the 4 of them. As for the appearance of the wheels and their construction, their appearance was like the gleaming of beryl, and the 4 had the same form, their construction being something like a wheel within a wheel. When they moved in any of the 4 directions without veering as they moved." So this is all a part of Ezekiel's vision. And we can see how somebody who wants to see things might construe this to be a flying saucer who's come and visited, and that Ezekiel's vision was indeed that from a flying saucer. But as we go on, we know that it's just Ezekiel's the way of, I think, talking about God's majesty and how God came to Ezekiel. Skipping to chapter 2, we have the vision of the scroll. And now we have God talking to Ezekiel. He said to me, "O mortal, stand up on your feet, and I will speak with you." And when he spoke to me, a spirit entered into me and set me on my feet, and I heard him speaking to me. He said to me, "Mortal, I am sending you to the people of Israel, to a nation of rebels who have rebelled against me. They and their ancestors have transgressed against me to this very day." So as with all the prophets, not counting Moses, but with certainly Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, and next week we'll be doing Zechariah, as with all of these, God calls these prophets, these messengers, these spokespeople to come to God's people and to try to draw them closer to God again. In every instance, and maybe we see it in our own time, it becomes quite simple to sort of get away from our roots. It becomes fairly simple to get away from what God has called us to be and the people that God has formed us to be. And so then, who or what is there that calls us to be God's people, who calls us to, again, be in this close, important relationship with God? And so, we see in the Bible, they call, Habakkuk, they call Malachi, they call Ezekiel, they call Isaiah. And they call these people so that the prophet can bring the people back closer to God again. And we see in Ezekiel, we go on and it's sort of the same thing. The descendants are impudent and stubborn. I'm sending you to them, and you shall say to them, "Thus says the Lord God." And whether they hear or refuse to hear, for they are a rebellious house, they shall know that there has been a prophet among them. And you, O mortal, do not be afraid of them, and do not be afraid of their words. Though briars and thorns surround you, and you live among scorpions, do not be afraid of their words, and do not be dismayed at their looks, for they are a rebellious house. You shall speak my words to them, whether they hear or refuse to hear, for they are a rebellious house. And so again, the promise, as like with Isaiah, Isaiah is told from the very get-go, as a part of the vision, he's kind of warned that, this is going to be a tough thing, that people maybe aren't going to listen to you, that people maybe are going to do just the opposite of what you call people to do. But that's what the prophets do. And, we can think about Jesus again. And obviously that Jesus met the kind of reception that Ezekiel maybe did, that Isaiah maybe did, that many of the prophets maybe did, that people have a hard time thinking about God, that people have a hard time thinking about being in this close relationship with God. because people may be tied up with other things, other concerns, other worries. You know, as they say, you know, reading the Bible doesn't, you know, pay our bills. And, you know, that's probably true, but reading the Bible may be the most important thing for our own lives, for who we are and understanding who we are as people. Probably that's more important than anything we would do outside of, you know, let's say church. And so the prophets are called, Ezekiel is called, to people, and they are warned that, you know, people may not listen that closely, may completely ignore you. We hear a little bit less about Ezekiel because, again, Ezekiel is in captivity already. Ezekiel is already speaking to people who are in exile, and I think the sort of long and short of his message is that, you know, something's going to happen. You know, come close to God, and God will act to make things, to return things to normal, which is exactly what happened. Cyrus, the Persian king, is actually called in the book of Isaiah the Messiah. God says that Cyrus is the anointed one, which is the meaning of the word Messiah. And Cyrus comes and lets the people return and actually even helps pay some of the bill for rebuilding the temple. And so what Ezekiel's talking about here in a very real way began to take place. Probably after Ezekiel's lifetime, but very close. And so just as God promised Moses and Isaiah and Jeremiah and now Ezekiel, the promise is all the same. Don't worry, I'll be with you. I'll put my words into your mouth. So we think about, you know, Ezekiel, and presumably most of us haven't had visions like this one at all, or of burning bushes, or of God in the temple. It may be more like a Jeremiah, or what we'll see next week with Zechariah. Just more of a very routine thing that as we have listened to Sunday school teachers, as we've been in church services, as we've listened to people talk about their faith, that we see that we too are being called back to be God's messengers in our time and in our place. Thank you. Let's conclude with a word of prayer. Eternal God, once again, we thank you for your word. We thank you for the way your word comes to us. We thank you for those people in the past who have meant so much to us and who have helped our faith grow. We ask that as we move forward that we would know always that your love goes with us, that we also don't need to be afraid, that although your message may seem difficult in this time and in this place, that you, as you promised all those before us, that don't worry, I'll be with you. I will put my words in your mouth. So we ask that you would send us into the world around us in hope and in confidence that your word will be met, that people will hear your word, and that people will return to you. Amen.